September has come to a close. After a long and arduous summer, here we are with Volume 3 of the Backlog Diaries. This has been an interesting volume to produce. There's not been any one particular title I've been absolutely chomping at the bit to play, and yet, when I look at the sum total of the experiences this quarter, it's a lot of really good, mechanically exciting games, and as an added bonus, I was actually able to run them all. So whether you're interested in first-person shooters, RPGs, Metroidvanias, roguelikes, or simply games where you bumble about and look at things, please join me as I discuss the 15 games I played this summer. What do you think of first when you hear the name Lara Croft? An iconic mascot character in the modern gaming landscape, the woman of every young man's dreams, landed, athletic, lethal, well endowed, but above all else she has this really fun energy about her, especially in the earlier games. She seems like a good hang, someone who will have your back in a fight but would also kill it at a pub quiz night. Yes, she does live in lavish opulence and probably has some strong opinions about wealth taxation, but we all love a problematic fave, don't we? Tomb Raider is one of those franchises that I have a very patchy history with. I've never played the original trilogy, so I have no frame of reference for how those games once handled. I genuinely think my first experience was the much maligned Underworld, followed swiftly by the decent Anniversary remake and its follow-up, and more recently the reboot trilogy. I think those newer games are an excellent update to the formula, drawing on the success of the Uncharted series with a few neat additions and changes along the way. The redesign of Croft herself I also think is a slick bit of modernising that swaps out the aggressively male-gazy stylings of the original character model for something a lot more inclusive. But there is one thing you can say about the reboot trilogy: it is a bit of a bad hang. While the game itself is fun to play, there's a specific element of campiness that is wholly missing from Proceedings. In its place, a somewhat doomed attempt to capitalise on the prestige drama sensibilities of modern AAA serious games. This version of Lara Croft wouldn't have your back in a fight, and she'd absolutely fuck things up for you at quiz night. While her most recent outings have become a little dark and self-serious, you don't have to look back all that far to find a fun, campy Tomb Raider, with a little goofy arcade game from 2010 that somehow understands the character better than any other entry in the franchise. I'm thrilled to say that once again we've started a volume of the Backlog Diaries with a bang. Lara Croft and the Guardian of Light is a great little twin-stick shooter that, as it turns out, is also a really competent, fully fledged Tomb Raider game as well, rammed to the gills with great puzzles, biting combat encounters, an ocean of optional content that feels meaningful and bespoke. It was a lot of fun to play start to finish, and changed up its ideas more in its 5-hour runtime than most big budget affairs manage in 30. It is goofy. They got Winnie the Pooh to play a 2,000-year-old Mayan warrior. The temples you explore seem to be kitted out with loads of machine guns and grenade launchers and plenty of ammo to keep you happy. You spend your time dodging fire traps and rolling boulders and fighting dinosaurs, and beyond all this sauce, all this flavour, the actual mechanics of the game are really solid. Movement and navigation feel great. Even the more fiddly elements like rolling boulders or the more time-sensitive puzzles have been tightened and quality checked to a needle point. Shooting equally feels great, with the core spear weapon having a meaty tactility to it, whether it's being used for combat or as a tool for navigation. See, there's some mechanical resonance there too. That's top-class game design. The levels are also suitably brilliant, making the best use of every mechanic and having these nice little touches like showing off previous rooms in the background of others to give a sense of scale and how far you have progressed. There's an impressive amount of variety on display despite the relatively small scale of the journey you are embarking on. And here's the thing I think this game really deserves a gold star for: they made a poisonous swamp level that's not absolutely miserable to navigate. From Software, you should take note. Even the dreaded boss encounters, the one paradigm of all game design I generally loathe, they're pretty great here too. Few and far between, but kinetic conclusions to the challenges that preceded them. Puzzles in themselves, and also a cathartic opportunity to fire a load of buckshot into the face of an immortal demon. I think all in all, The Guardian of Light is a game of competence as much as it is of fun. I never once felt like I was wrestling with the controls. Never once found myself at a loss as to where to go or what to do, but in that same breath, executing cool moves and solving puzzles always felt great. Everything just works, and it works incredibly well. It's a strong argument for the divestment of big studios away from the mega-budget time sinks that ruin lives and ultimately never quite live up to the hype, in favour of a bunch of smaller, dafter affairs like this. It's baffling to me that they only made 2 of these when the premise and core mechanics are so strong, and the execution is delivered so beautifully. I suspect it's a case of poor marketing. Part of the reason it took me so bloody long to play this myself is that I didn't realise that it was a full-fat Tomb Raider experience. That's on them, really. I still have a lot of time for the reboot trilogy. They are great games that, moribund vibes aside, play around with the formula in interesting ways, but don't you wish sometimes that the bigger franchise games were still like this? Arcadey, goofy, beach episode vibes, still worthy tentpoles of artistic integrity. The first thing you do in Diaries of a Spaceport Janitor is explore a dungeon. Your reward for doing this is a curse most foul, a disembodied skull that follows you everywhere you go, breaking the silence every few minutes with a vile screech. The impact of this curse doesn't expand out all that much, but in a very defined and obvious way it doesn't need to. Its presence is the point, because as it turns out, the real curse is, well, everything else. Diaries of a Spaceport Janitor is a game about incinerating trash. Most of what you do in it involves making ends meet from one day to the next. You're paid by the item. You have a limited amount of charge each day to perform this task, thus limiting your earning potential. In order to recharge, you need to sleep, and in order to sleep, you need to eat. Also, you have gender dysphoria, and left unchecked, this will make the very act of playing the game nigh on impossible, nauseating even. Tending to your needs requires resources that themselves require money, and the whole thing becomes this tedious bout for survival with a very flimsy and ill-defined goal in sight. It's brilliant. It's probably the most exciting game I've ever played. For the duration of this project, I keep going on about vibes, but I really think this is a critical element in the enjoyment of a game, and part of that is the understanding that the approximation of something often ends up feeling way more authentic and immersive than just doing the thing. Diaries of a Spaceport Janitor is a game that fakes it all the time. It's a game you can't lose. It's a game whose economy doesn't make sense. It's a game that allows you to metagame the in-universe luck index by essentially bribing the gods. You're not rewarded for loyalty, you're not rewarded full stop. Your goal throughout this game is to obtain and assemble 3 parts of a quest tablet in order to rid yourself of this screaming skull, but then what? The choices made in its design and its mechanics make the experience feel massive. The titular diary being something you have to write yourself, the small scale of the world juxtaposed with how impossible it feels to navigate because of all the directional arrows, not in spite of them. It recognises that you need to be a part of this world, and for most people, being part of a world means getting lost, seeking familiarity and repetition, knowing that the optimal survival strategy is probably just picking the cheap, nutrient-dense energy drink to stage off hunger instead of a more substantial meal, and ultimately wanting for something you probably won't ever have. Intentionally frustrating, bafflingly dense, moody, dark, funny, profound, a game that captures the experience of being human better than anything I've ever played. If I were to mandate you to play just one game from this project, it would be this. Previously on the Backlog Diaries, I had played and adored Even the Ocean, a brilliant low-budget puzzle platformer by the 2-person studio Analgesic Productions. It's a game with bags of heart and a wonderfully inventive world to explore, and so, in the aftermath of this, I was excited to play this other game by the team, Anodyne. I had played this before and sort of bounced off it a bit. I'm not that in love with Zelda homages. I find the framework of those games runs the risk of missing the forest for the trees. The reality is that what makes those top-down Zelda games so special is the secret sauce that their studios add to the mix, rather than the format itself. Just this year alone, I've played multiple decent but not particularly imaginative iterations of this format of game. So when a relatively unknown quantity brings their own interpretation, I'm naturally cautious. Back then, I hadn't played enough of Anodyne to render this judgment, however. I wanted to give it another shot, especially after experiencing what that team is capable of in other titles, and wouldn't you know, this is actually pretty great. Anodyne has that trademark strangeness that has come to define analgesic productions. Its world is bizarre, its central protagonist, equipped only with a broom and an aimless sense of obligation, explores a world that seldom makes sense, traversing dungeons, overcoming obstacles, defeating bosses in order to find keys that unlock more dungeons, I guess? I'll cut to the chase here. While this is a great game, I don't particularly love it. What's successful about it doesn't stir in me what even the ocean did. I find it less readable, less tactile an experience, and its combat encounters are a little messy and unsatisfying. I also don't really like the bosses, but I don't really like bosses in general. I think I'm going to have to write a dedicated essay about this at some point, because I don't want folk thinking I'm just some big baby who hates the challenges. I play roguelikes all the time. Bloodborne is one of my favourite games. I just don't really like bosses. It's a shame because what this game is doing in terms of navigation, world design, and the general bizarreness of its presentation is incredibly cool. A lot of Zelda-likes I've played in the past, even more contemporary ones like this year's Master Key and Castaway, build themselves around this presumed idea that the developers want players to experience something that feels like it could have been made in the past, like these are the lost games of yesteryear, held in stasis, encapsulating the rose-tinted goggles of what we thought those other games looked and felt like to play. This is incredibly modern feeling. No, not modern, that doesn't quite capture it. It's like this timeline split off after Link's Awakening, and on one track we have what games are in their totality now, and on the other is this continuation of older design principles, evolution of ideas broken away from the tropes and conventions of a more homeostatic environment. Beyond this, it's also a game that revels in how ambiguous its story is, how little it explains about certain mechanics, like its card system, which I'm still not quite sure what it even is, other than a means of gating progress through the world. A peculiar experiment in expectations and actively thinking about the metatextual consequences of entropic design. I had heard from those whose thoughts I value that the sequel Anodyne 2 is a much more complete feeling and smart experience, so maybe I should chalk this one up to being a primer for the other games this team has made. Whatever the outcome, I remain incredibly excited about the output of this studio. So very rarely does a horror game have you play as an infant, and there's a very good reason for this. It's hard to manifest a sense of peril that is still in line with ESRB ratings, and a child in danger is still to this day an incredibly sensitive, taboo subject. So when a game tasks you with navigating a dark, nightmarish realm as a toddler, it's enough to pique my interest. Among the Sleep does just this. A first-person narrative horror experience where you stumble about, teddy bear clutched to your chest, exploring at first your home before venturing into more fantastical dreamscapes, and it becomes quickly apparent something more insidious is stalking you through these nightmarish spaces. What makes Among the Sleep scary at first is that you don't really know what the consequences of being caught are. The fear is the mechanic, the unknown keeping you on edge while you're trying to navigate this world. And it's an interesting piece of design that there isn't actually any tangible peril at first. You catch glimpses of this entity in the peripheries, through audio cues, slammed doors, the creaks and groans of the house, a brief blur past a window. It makes those early stages of the experience really tense. It's one of those rare instances where poor feedback elevates the experience rather than getting in its way. You don't know how slow and quiet you have to be, what foul things await in the dark, whether holding Teddy closer to you to illuminate the way even offers any tangible sense of protection. The fear is the mechanic. Unfortunately, Among the Sleep falls afoul of its own expectation, and eventually it culminates in more traditional horror game tropes. The back half of the game sort of falls apart because of it. The allegory becomes more clear if it wasn't already, and the storytelling suffers for it. It also eventually does give you the risk of being caught, and a fail state for doing so, and it stops being scary almost immediately because of it. Horror is in the anticipation, not always in the execution, and I feel bad for lambasting Among the Sleep for this because I genuinely can't think of another way to do this. You have to escalate your ideas eventually. You have to make good on player expectations, and it's no small feat to do this. A lot of horror fiction struggles to nail the landing like this. One of the things that makes our nightmares so potent is the idea that they never end, but this doesn't translate all that well in most mediums. A book has an ending, a film has an ending, a game has the capacity to be infinite, but that sense of endlessness doesn't carry with it the same weight of horror. It mostly results in diminishing returns and a strong, mournful desire to have a finite end. In this regard, keeping the experience short, concise, and having it conclude, even if said conclusion was a bit underwhelming, it was the right choice, even if the execution leaves a little to be desired. Half-Life is my white whale, a game I've owned for donkey's years and yet never once played. Through cultural osmosis I know a great deal about it, but the act of playing it for the first time in 2024 has been nothing short of enlightening. There's a reason this goes on so many greatest games of all time lists. It's really bloody good. A work of blisteringly tight design, inventive storytelling, and immersion still unlike anything I've played that came out since, and the real star of the show is its setting. Black Mesa is one of the most iconic game worlds of all time for good reason, but actually experiencing it firsthand is like seeing the Sagrada Familia up close and personal. You don't realise the size and scope of it until you do. From that first long, moody tram ride to the labs, to the attempted escape from the hell somewhat of your own making, Black Mesa is an exciting web of corridors, tunnels, vents, and oceans of radioactive goo. So many spaces open up to dwarven chasms, rooms so big that you can't see the roof or the floor. It so deftly teeters the line between impossible and grounded, a place that feels like it shouldn't make sense, and yet it so often proves that it does, with loops around areas that give you tangible feedback about where you are in this place, gazing upon familiar obstacles from different angles. Not a sense of progress, like one would think, but rather a validation of the enormity of this game world, which itself isn't even a dot on the map. In the few moments you breach the surface, you are met with towering canyons, horizons eclipsed by the earth around you. You are buried. This is a tomb. The game itself is a lot of fun. It's very clear why the Source engine resulted in a lot of fast-paced multiplayer shooters. Sometimes I felt like I was on rocket skates moving around the building. That speed with which you move did come to bite me on the arse a few times, with some of the more fiddly platforming bits falling afoul of Gordon Freeman's gecko-like qualities. It is here where I found my enjoyment of the game waned somewhat. There's a lot of trial and error in Half-Life. It almost has this Dragon's Lair quality to it, where taking a corner at the wrong angle or speed, or entering a room while looking the wrong way, results in you getting insta-gibbed and having to reload. The game is generous with its saving and checkpoints, but feedback isn't always so readable, and there were moments I felt like I was this close to just switching off the game and never returning to it. Blast pits, am I right? But inevitably, like that Yoda Olives meme, I kept coming back, and will continue to come back, because what lies ahead of me continues to be special. Every frustrating moment is superseded by a sigh of relief and a round of hooting and hollering as I figured out a brilliant scheme to make it past deadly obstacle after deadly obstacle, unloading my arsenal into the face of monster and marine alike, becoming that inalienable boogeyman as scrawled on many a wall in blood. Everything is deftly crafted to make you feel like they all fucked with the wrong scientist. Half-Life is one of those titles where you have to put your own feelings aside about what you consider to be its flaws in order to recognize just how important a game it really is. We wouldn't have the modern FPS landscape without it. We probably wouldn't have Steam, Valve's enduring license to print money, without it. Thanks to its creation tools, dozens if not hundreds if not thousands of careers, games, artistic endeavors have been launched. And yes, maybe in its absence, some other evolutionary tract may have cropped up, but this isn't the multiverse. This is an appreciation of actual, tangible history. Of all the games on this backlog list, I think this might be the most important. First things first, it's important to acknowledge that the ship is a multiplayer title, and this single-player component is clearly designed as an extended tutorial in order to ensure that the player fully understands how the rules of this game work in a safe and narrow environment. With that in mind, it's not a very good isolated experience, and it's a shame because the game's premise is the perfect fodder for a ground-up dedicated solo game. It's a classic setup. Trapped aboard an ocean liner, a maniacal villain sets you and your fellow passengers up with an ultimatum. Everyone has an assigned target, someone to hunt and someone hunting them. Whoever is left alive once the dust settles wins. It's those classic battle royale shenanigans, translated into a social stealth opportunity a la Hitman, but how it's manifested here is in a sequence of heavily scripted tutorial missions built around a secret goal to game the game and get out alive. Which again, a great premise, but it's not good. And I don't really understand how any of the mechanics as presented here even translate to a multiplayer setting. Everything is so incredibly clunky, poorly explained, and beyond anything else, dull. It's a game about hiding in plain sight, seeking out tools to aid you in offing your targets in ways that don't arouse suspicion, and maybe all this makes more sense when put in front of a group of actual players as your opponents, but in this instance I find it hard to see the light. The game almost has a sort of rubbish Sims-like quality to it, where there's the granularity of your actions, following your fellow passengers around as they do their silly little NPC things. You yourself are burdened by half a dozen or so survival meters, ranging from hunger, thirst and stamina to needing to take a piss, none of which seems to have much impact on how the game plays, I'll be honest. There are systems in here where I think more tactile mechanics are needed, and this is the big takeaway for me. Everything is so awkward to execute that I can't even muster enthusiasm for the ambition of the whole thing. I don't really play multiplayer games anyway. This was probably a bad pick for this project, but I am especially nonplussed about the prospects of dealing with these mechanics in a setting with other live players. Also, and maybe this is because I just played Half-Life, I cannot believe this is a Source Engine game. It's ugly as hell, and you crawl around the boat slow as molasses. I'm no stranger to tolerating clumsily executed design principles in order to give a game its dues. Sometimes these things take a while to get going. On occasion there's some secret sauce in the latter stages that make putting the work in, but for the ship, I won't know about that because its biggest sin is how frustrating it is to play. There's no wiggle room for improvisation here, despite how clearly ImSim coded the experience is. The consequences for failing an objective are that you have to start the whole mission from scratch. While missions aren't particularly long, given their crippling linearity and the fact that it's quite easy to fall afoul of poor feedback, this started to grate really quickly, and I only really managed about 3 missions before I had enough. It's exceptionally disappointing because old-timey battle royale on a boat is the perfect premise for a more detailed, focused experience. I can see a version of this that absolutely revels in its setting, the mechanics and the overall sensation of being in that world, but it's not that. And I shouldn't judge it based on what it's not, but what it is a bit duff. Don't waste your time like I did. As you can probably tell from a lot of the gameplay I'm using for these videos, I'm not exactly what you would call a graceful player. There's a certain level of cognitive delay that I experience when playing action-heavy games, one that more often than not leads to difficulties with more challenging elements. It's part of the reason I struggle with Metroid-likes, the search-action genre in which exploration often goes hand in hand with precision and timing, 2 skills I simply do not possess. However, in constraining my movement options, Dandara delights me as an experience I was able to gel with extremely well, at least at first. Dandara's setup is an interesting take on the worlds of these search action titles, a multi-directional player space where up, down, left and right are their own things and also each other. It's a great setting, almost feeling like one of those unassembled cardboard model kits. You navigate by jumping from surface to surface, avoiding projectiles and enemies to explore and unlock new abilities in newer areas. I have to give the game credit for feeling so coherent and easy to navigate despite how turned around its levels are. When there's no fixed point for ground, there could have been the risk of it being a bit of a headache trying to make sense of where to go and how to get there. Especially with the simplicity of the game's map, I was worried about getting caught up in the vicious loop, but this didn't really happen all that much. And even when it did, there was a simple pleasure to be found in navigating that loop faster and faster as I became more familiar with the topography. It's It's really exciting when a game takes a familiar network of design principles and quite literally turns them on their head. Combat in the game is a simple affair made complex by the fact that your opponents could be attacking from any direction. Dandara mixes wider open spaces with narrow corridors and boxed-in arenas that fully make use of these little wrinkles in the design, and the result is that the challenge feels constantly fresh. However, the consequences for failure are quite harsh. This is a feature I've seen creeping into search action games a lot recently, as I'll go into later in the video, but it really does seem like game designers are allergic to checkpoints at the moment. Like pretty much everything under the sun these days, Dandara takes a lot of cues from Dark Souls, with that particular brand of semi-permadeath design that always runs the risk of becoming the worst of both worlds. Dying can set you back quite a way, losing your accumulated currency to a ghost that remains where you have gasped your last, but retaining any items or progress markers obtained along the way. You have limited healing potential at first and can't take too many hits, and so death is a conscious factor in how you approach this world. It's executed fine here. I didn't find myself too frustrated with the backtracking needed since navigation is so zippy, and returning to your ghost reclaims any accumulated currency on top of what you would have earned on your journey back, so it acts as a sort of organic grind that doesn't feel too arduous to do. New abilities are found in the world, and as the reward for navigating some of the tougher challenges, but upgrades are bought using this currency. In a way, it's a nice accommodation to players like me who are tactically shit at playing games, but I also can't help but wonder if a more traditional design framework for Dandara would have worked better. Upgrades in the world, health drops from enemies, you know, the classics. While I don't mind this hybrid design paradigm, I do think it's maybe time to put it to pasture. And it got especially grueling as I made it past the first major boss and into a game that was structurally a lot more dangerous to navigate. Eventually, it got the better of me, and I had to concede that the victory fanfare would not be heard by me this time. In spite of my grumblings, Dandara is a stonking experience, a unique addition to a genre well filled, and above all else, it's really a lot of fun to play. I think if you're less dyspraxic than me, you'll probably get a lot more out of it, and its setting, art direction, and gameplay loop are all a winning combination. It's strange to think that there was an alternate timeline in which Kingsway just disappeared. Earlier this year, the perennial ratfucks at Warner Bros. Announced that a slew of titles published under the Adult Swim Games label were being delisted, and thankfully, after some pushback, instead the rights to those games have been returned to their creators. For this, I'm grateful, not to give the most aggressively anti-art corporation in the world any credit, but we lose so much from these irrational licensing decisions. And even games that I have no interest in, or even ones that just aren't very good, deserve to remain available, if not through legal means, then certainly less legitimate ones. Kingsway's salvation from the corpse pile in particular is a blessing because this game is really bloody good. A charming, inventive roguelike that melds strong core design principles with a wildly out-of-the-box framing of the player and the game world. Some of you may be too young to appreciate what all this on screen is supposed to represent, but many decades ago this is what personal computer operating systems looked like. This is why it was called Windows after all. Panels upon panels upon panels, stacking in an easy-to-pass way that made navigating files, honestly, a lot easier than whatever we have now. A simpler time. Maybe not necessarily a better system than what is currently available, but certainly one that is a lot more aesthetically pleasing to me. Kingsway uses the Windows system to craft a gaming experience that tests the player's spatial awareness and ability to juggle tasks. You navigate a world in one pane, your inventory sits in another, fights appear on yet another, sometimes attacks break out on their own, scooting across the screen, and you have to intercept them in real time, creating an even greater level of kinetic interaction. This is great! Not only is Kingsway a visually pleasing experience, it is engaging in a way that a lot of games simply aren't. It's a menus game where the menus are the game, a title where executive function is the challenge, where strategy is brought in through how the player arranges their windows to more efficiently pass their tasks and actions, where sometimes even the best laid plans are at the mercy of a single mistimed click. It's a roguelike, with all the baggage that entails, but something really pleasant about how it sets itself up is that it feels more like a grand adventure for it. You travel the world, taking on quests, navigating dungeons, fighting foul beasts and upgrading your abilities, skills and gear along the way, then something gets the better of you. and you pass the torch on to another impressionable little whelk, who this time has a different set of abilities, skills and gear to venture forward into the world. The framing is the great joy of this experience, but under the hood there is a solid little game there too. It's excellent. I really recommend you play it even if you have a passing interest in the genre, and thank God it's still available despite the ill intent of some dickhead in an expensive suit. Supergiant is an interesting studio. Seemingly built from the ground up with a narrative-first design ethos, their games still retain a sense of mechanical complexity, and as a result they are the kings of ludonarrative harmony. Hades is now the poster child of this process, but they sprang onto the scene with a bang in their debut title Bastion, which excelled both as a structurally fascinating story and a really cohesive tactile action RPG. The thing is, because Supergiant are always swinging for the stars, bold, out there ideas explored in unconventional ways, their work inevitably won't connect with all types of players, even fans of their other work. Having loved Bastion, I bounced off Transistor in a massive way, and I found Hades wasn't what I wanted from that type of experience. And then we have this little curio which asks the question, what if the religious connotations of football were a little more explicit? This is a massive oversimplification of what Pyre is. Part competitive sports game, part choose your own adventure visual novel. It's a fascinating world to explore and a really novel approach to player interaction. I don't really like it. I think I just really like Bastion. But having said that, I don't want to dismiss what is a really fascinating narrative experience, so here are a few more in-depth thoughts. Pyre is a game about the journey of a band of miscreants called the Nightwings, lost souls trapped in a purgatorial space that's a sort of like a cross between the afterlife and a mega jail. It's a bizarre space, packed with detritus and giants, a land forged out of the abyss, and a collection of communities built out of the commonality of their desperation. All who find themselves trapped here have but one saving grace, a light at the end of the tunnel, which is an opportunity for ascension through the completion of tournaments called rites. All of this is lovingly crafted. Like everything Supergiant do, the presentation and art direction here are second to none. Even down to the font and text boxes, there's an artistry on display at all times. It's one of the prettiest games I've ever played. It's also narratively really engaging, with scores of great writing, brilliantly designed characters, and a backdrop that is just really unique and colourful. It's fantasy not built from the same tired tropes as everything else, and in these regards the game must be applauded. But the rights themselves are a much harder sell for me. A sort of cross between FIFA and Dota. 2 teams of 3 compete for possession of an orb in order to extinguish their opponent's pyre. There are modifiers such as different attributes depending on which team member you play as, the layout of the arena, the team you face off against, and items you can equip prior to engagement, plus a level up system that grants a boon to certain parameters. But at its core, it's a simple game of grab the ball, knock it into the opponent's goal, and I don't like it. No matter how much I play the rights, inarguably the most critical and important element of this game, they are something I dread coming to each time they occur, an experience that inevitably sours the whole thing for me. With even the most open of mind, I just can't get on with them. It sucks, in particular because I want to applaud Supergiant for making games this interesting, this against the grain, but part of me secretly wishes they just revert to making visual novels and leave the action to someone else, because inevitably there is a pattern here. Bastion was mechanically their least interesting work, but it's the only thing of theirs I absolutely adored start to finish. It feels so fucking cheeky to suggest a studio stop trying to reinvent the wheel, and maybe there is some unconscious bias at play here as someone who detests football and laments the fact that it's the only thing that a lot of folk I know ever talk about. But this is the fact of life. You can't love everything, even when on paper it's brilliant. Dating this video horribly, but I really didn't like Furiosa, and I find Chapel Rowan's music just okay. That's the way of things sometimes. Once again, Pyre is an experience I plucked away at for a few sessions before inevitably deciding that it just isn't for me. But I'm grateful for the experience nonetheless, and I hope Supergiant continue to make these astringent, fascinating curios and don't just get caught in the loop of making Hades sequels for the rest of their lives. These are the sort of games people should be making. My first console was the N64. As such, my relationship with the 8 and 16-bit eras of gaming is limited. Most of my experience with this style of game is confined to modern takes on the classics. Like this. Shovel Knight is a brilliant little experience, refined and tightened to an impenetrable knot. It paints the history of games in such an enduring and beautifully crafted light, it's impossible not to fall in love with it. It's also bastard hard, which thanks to a few mechanical decisions has reduced my enthusiasm for the project a little bit, but I'll get to that later. Shovel Knight is a platformer built around its titular gardening tool. All its verbs reflect some aspect of this weapon, attacking, digging, bouncing off enemies and terrain, and the result is a slick, fiendish and precise gameplay experience that really tests your ability to understand the limits of your skill set. Levels are built around this, with terrain, obstacles and foes all designed to be utilised as both a roadblock and an opportunity. A well-timed bounce more often than not leading to an alternative path or a secret room, not to mention giving you the ability to reach those hard-to-grasp ledges where all manner of juicy treasures might be kept. Or, on occasion, an enemy to fuck with your expectations. It's clever like this. Animation supports all of this in really cute ways. Enemies are well designed, but it's the knight himself who is the most expressive both in action and in the little cumulative moments of joy at finding treasure or beating one of the stage bosses. These bosses I could take or leave, to be honest. A lot of the time they follow the classic trend of big empty arena and pattern recognition, and I don't think they really capitalise on what makes the game tick. However, it does feel really good to get a bounce combo going as they flail about trying to hit you. I appreciate the design even if it's not the thing to write home about. The other issue I have with Shovel Knight is that for a game about finding treasure, which impacts the game in tangible ways through the purchase of upgrades and new tools for combat and navigation, it's really easy to just lose it all. Dying sets you back to the last checkpoint, but it also leaves a percentage of your well-gotten gains behind at the site of your defeat. In classic FromSoft fashion, you get one chance to reclaim this, but there are so many parts of levels where it's basically impossible to reach your swag without dying again. Whether it's teetering just below an abyssal cowl or abreast a pallet of pain, sometimes you just have to accept defeat and move on. Part of the problem with this single piece of design is that it frustrates you further when you're already flustered. As mentioned before, this is a tough old experience. There will be sections you'll need to attempt again and again, and the fact that you risk finishing a level with less than what you entered with runs the risk of the whole endeavour becoming a Pyrrhic victory. It's not the end of the world, but I don't really see how the game benefits from this over a more conventional checkpoint system. The good thing about Shovel Knight is that it's not just one game, it's 4. And as such, to give a more rounded impression of the experience, even though I suck at it, I played a bit of the other campaigns too, and here's a quick roundup of what I thought. Plague Knight, I really didn't get on with. I found the bomb jump mechanic a little too fiddly to be enjoyable. Spectre Knight was great, I really love the peculiarities of how you navigate spaces with this character. The attack, dash and wall running feel really good to pull off. King Knight is an interesting one because of how particular his moveset is. It's all about shoulder barging and using that momentum to bounce off things, taking essentially the principles of Shovel Knight's moves to their logical extreme. I dig it. While I didn't come close to completing any of the 4 campaigns due to how bad I am at precision platformers, I have come to appreciate exactly what makes this series so special. The fact that all 4 games in the collection repurpose the same set of levels is an ingenious bit of design that really highlights just how much Yacht Club games got right on the first pass. Not everyone can pull off such a feat. Kudos to them for managing to. Shovel Knight is an experience it's hard not to recommend. You won't find a sharper, more devious and ultimately rewarding platformer out there, in arguably one of the best in show and frankly unbelievable value for money. Zeboyd Games makes these really cool traditional 8 and 16-bit JRPG style games. Breath of Death 7, Cthulhu Saves the World, Cosmic Star Heroine, and the recently released This Way Madness Lies all utilise familiar aesthetic tropes and on the surface feel like a welcome homage to the kind of games a lot of us loved growing up, with a humorous, satirical subversion of common narrative tropes. But the thing that should really be getting folk out of their chairs for these games is how tightly designed they are. Cosmic Star Heroine in particular was a game game that requires players to use the whole buffalo, in turn crafting a pint-sized but galaxy-spanning adventure that was an absolute blast to play. It is Zeboyd's contribution to Penny Arcade on the rain-slicked Precipice of Darkness 3 that stands out the most for me, as the first in this particular series I've played, and a departure from the CRPG leanings of the previous two entries. There are a lot of fascinating choices being made in this game. More relaxed in how it offers the player freedom to approach its combat challenges, the class system is designed with a surprisingly wide array of tactical options, utilising a Grandia-esque ATB combat system to further mix things up. No longer concerned with raw damage output, the ability to push your opponent's turn back or to set your own time bombs to take them out later in the fight makes for unusual wrinkles to what I've been used to in the genre before. The more you level up classes and subclasses, the more you realise that there's a lot of cool combinations you can use in combat, in parts even automating the processes through the synergizing of specific abilities. What all this means is that you look forward to fights, not only as challenges in their own right, but as opportunities to try out new strategies, and I don't think it's any accident that damage and health parameters have been built to support this. Fights go on just long enough to be interesting, but not so long that you groan whenever the next one begins. It takes a deft hand to get that balance right, and I think Zeboyd does a fantastic job of this. Unfortunately, this is a Penny Arcade game, one very clearly written by webcomic co-creators Jerry Holkins and Mike Krahulik, and as a result it is an absolutely chronic experience. I'm not a Penny Arcade fan. I think those strips are ugly to look at and badly written. Things aren't much better on the rain-slicked Precipice of Darkness. Imagine the most trite, languid, mid-2000s epic bacon atheist humour and piss-poor character writing laid across far too many text boxes, dragging out what otherwise would be a pretty decent RPG. Maybe this would have been more tolerable as a fan project in 2005, but this was a premium game that came out in 2012, one co-created by a duo who had experience writing cute, funny adventures already. Okay, so no one's going to be making 4-hour story analysis video essays about Cosmic Star Heroine, but it was a damn sight better than this shit. A star for the combat, a big fat F for everything else. Prior to the release of the astonishingly good Psychonauts 2, Double Fine had a somewhat muted period of minor success making smaller, unassuming titles in a variety of genres. Costume Quest was one such experience, a daft little Halloween-themed RPG built around the idea of trick-or-treating and fighting hordes of candy-grabbing goblins. It's a bit of fun, but I never finished it when I first played it a decade ago. Picking up my old save, I spent a couple more hours in the game exploring, fighting, and working towards its final encounter, finishing the thing and generally feeling positive enough about the experience that I immediately started Costume Quest 2, which I think is a stark improvement on an already quite charming and well-made game, but that's a topic for the next video. Let's focus on the first title for now. Costume Quest's story can be written on the back of a stamp. Its cast of characters aren't particularly interesting, but their incidental dialogue is charming and brief, the stakes are engaging enough, and the game is brilliantly paced. Set in the backdrop of a Halloween street party, you navigate your neighbourhood, the local mall, and a carnival in pursuit of your sister who has been stolen away by a candy-grabbing witch and her goblin horde. It's extremely silly, but it gets the job done, and results in a light RPG adventure that really capitalises on its setting through its mechanics. Costumes are classes. You unlock new ones by collecting crafting materials like cardboard and cloth. Your currency is candy. There are trading cards to collect. You knock on doors, gambling on whether you receive more candy or a nasty surprise in the shape of a combat encounter. Combat itself is suitably engaging too, with timed button presses reminiscent of the Mario RPG games, although not quite as tightly configured, and while options are limited, there is enough going on that kept me engaged until the credits. It's also really nice to look at. Character design is incredibly charming in that way Double Fine always delivers. While there are only a few actual levels, they're designed in ways that encourage exploration, full of small interactable things that give you a few pieces of candy, simple pointless additions that add a texture to the world. Honestly, I don't even know why I stopped playing before. It certainly wasn't out of boredom. Double Fine absolutely kills it at this kind of experience. You look at their back catalogue, and yes, Day of the Tentacle, Full Throttle, and Psychonauts are the standouts, but they've made loads of these cool, smaller titles. I want to check out more of them now. A putrid, malignant community. Difficult decisions to be made, a harsh green colour palette like the evil version of Brat Summer. The Shrouded Isle is a game about control and fanaticism and doing nasty shit for the greater good, and it is excellent. As the leader of an island community in thrall of old gods who may or may not even be there, your job is to assemble a team of adjudicators from the 5 noble houses in order to maintain discipline, fervour, obedience, penitence and ignorance amongst your residents, with a sacrifice required at the end of each season. If any of these 5 parameters drop to 0, it's game over. Alongside this, you have to keep the 5 houses happy in order to prevent a revolt. It's all very complicated, you see, managing those fallen on hard times while desperately clinging to your pathetic notions of power. What this translates to is a lot of really interesting small tactical decisions that require a bigger picture to be factored into them. There are so many different elements that can lead to your undoing, and sometimes the correct decision is to not pursue your goals, but for a moment to prevent your head being separated from your body. Sometimes the correct decision is to sacrifice someone who does not deserve to be purged in such a way, because the optimal candidate is from a family that has taken one too many hits in a row. The families themselves are an interesting bunch. There isn't a defined narrative in the Shrouded Isle, nor defined characters, but rather a sequence of archetypes with procedurally assigned characteristics. Each family member has a vice and virtue that is at first hidden from the player. A secondary goal of each campaign is to find out what those vices and virtues are and how potent they are. A minor virtue doesn't undo a major vice, and well, vice versa. This dichotomy adds an extra strategic layer to proceedings, because a family member with a major vice is a prime candidate for the chopping block, and it might be the case that you pick them as an adjudicator for their house specifically with this in mind. A little political assassination thrown into the mix to rid yourself of a nuisance. It's a clever bit of design, and what it really reminds me of, bizarrely, is the toy soldiers element of the Firaxis XCOM games, where you inevitably end up building relationships with characters you've essentially made yourself. This is a sort of middle ground between that and more defined character writing, and I think it works really well. It is here, though, that I find myself at odds with one of the major design choices of the Shrouded Isle. It's a numbers game. It's all point values and meters. Modifiers have an assigned value that the player can see. Picking adjudicators for the monthly actions visibly impacts the 5 meters in ways that are easily readable, and I don't actually think it needs any of that. Especially when the game is full of fascinatingly open to interpretation flavor text that basically does the same job. The closest comparison I could make is Nerial's Reign series, the Tinder-style kingdom management games. In those titles, meters still exist, but a lot of the numbers assigned to choice and consequences are hidden from the player. As such, there's a certain element of gut feeling that goes into decision making that I find way more compelling than just treating the whole endeavour like a stock market spreadsheet. It's not a huge black mark against the game, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot over the years. With fidelity never higher, games have the capacity now to divest themselves away from the use of numerical value indicators, and they just don't a lot of the time. Don't get me wrong, I do love it when you hit 4 9s in a Final Fantasy game, and I think there's a lot of pleasure to be derived from number go up, but I think we're wasting the opportunities of our audiovisual and literary capacity to understand the changes brought about by our actions in games. I can clearly see a version of the Shrouded Isle with these numerical values hidden, and I think it would work just as well, if not better. The game as it stands, though, 2 big thumbs up from me. I liked it a lot. I have to confess something. Like many ignorant folk in the community, I too once saw the words visual novel and rolled my eyes whenever a new game was revealed to be in that genre. If I wanted to read a book, I'd read a book, I would think to myself as I went to play yet another RPG without putting 2 and 2 together. The reality is, a lot more things are visual novels than you think, and even the most purist approach to the genre has a lot to offer the more nervous traditional gamer. It's not a dirty word. However, I still appreciate that VNs are a hard sell for many of us, for one reason in particular. A lot of writing in games is bad, and if a game relies solely on its writing, this can be a death sentence. Or so I thought before playing Solstice, the 2016 title from Moacube, and realizing that a solid story can in fact overcome lackluster prose. There's not a lot I can say about this game, because it's incredibly mechanically light, a series of passages and dialogues amid a backdrop of nicely rendered settings and character art. You have to choose a path from time to time, and your decisions impact the outcome of the story. Really, it's the setting that is the most interesting thing about Solstice. Your adventure takes place within the Jewel of the North, a self-contained city sat at the heart of an impossibly vast Arctic tundra that is host to some deeply disturbing social dynamics. Think Bioshock without the deeply unpleasant depictions of mental health, but way more implied sexual slavery. A society in which the law and justice are built around unblemished and deeply evil contracts where breaches are punishable by exile into the frozen wastes. Obviously, the question arises, why would anyone willingly live in this place, especially when this is not a post-apocalyptic world and there are wide-reaching communities that presumably aren't built around deeply disturbing slave master aristocracies. But this is where the rest of the game comes in, as you begin to learn about exactly why everyone came here, with the dark secrets of almost everyone tied directly into the mysterious disappearance of one of the residents. The question of what actually is going on ultimately becomes the most interesting thing about Solstice, because the writing itself is not that great. A lot of the dialogue is ropey as hell, bordering on cringe, and for a story set in a fantasy setting, it falls back on a lot of very specific real-world idioms that feel very out of place. While the character backstories and motivations are interesting on paper, the way they are revealed feels quite sloppy as compared to other titles in the genre. It's a bit of a mixed bag, to be honest. Like several entries in this backlog project, it's an experience that is frustrating more than out-and-out bad. It has the bones of a bigger and better game, if more care and attention had been put into the quality of its writing. If you're on the fence about this genre, I wouldn't start with this one, but it was engaging enough a story to keep me playing right to the end. It's not a particularly long experience, and with multiple paths to the ending, there's reason enough to return. Hollow Knight is a game I've played before, but bounced off of because of, you guessed it, the bosses. They're tough old encounters that require precision and a deft hand, and once again I am at the beck and mercy of my pudding brain. But having exposed myself more to the genre in recent years, in particular Haiku the Robot, I've reckoned with the fact that I do actually have the patience to at least attempt the kind of pattern recognition and skill needed to best these challenges, so long as I actually want to. And so I return to this, the final boss of contemporary search action games, the notorious, venerated, legendary title that is the face of a million tired memes about its long-awaited sequel. Is Hollow Knight actually any good? Yes, but not without caveats. It's hard to argue that Hollow Knight isn't an exceptional experience. It doesn't really do anything new, but what it does do is elevated by its incredible sense of place and sharp level design. It's a really nice world to explore, feeling like it's taking the best of both Metroid and Dark Souls and actually melding them together well, understanding what makes both of those games really tick. Exploration is king here, a vast web of interlocking passages, chambers, locked doors, bizarre contraptions, and legions of deranged foes, all waiting to take a chunk out of you. It's here where I get to be a little shallow and say the art direction of Hollow Knight is just really bloody nice. It's all the deft touches, like how foreground, middle ground and background have interactables, giving the 2D planes a not quite a 3D feel, but instead the sense that there is stuff going on there. It's a step above the usual parallax scrolling stuff a lot of devs use to breathe life into their worlds. It allows these spaces to absolutely drip with mood. The world of Hollow Knight is just really engaging to be in. You want to explore every corner, not just for the opportunity to seek out some tangible reward, but also for a chance encounter with something to bring more light to the mystery of this whole space. Navigation took a while for me to get to grips with, as Hollow Knight plays a little more precisely than what I'm used to. There's no coyote time here. Actions require premeditation and spatial awareness. Hitboxes are not so clear either. It exists in the school of you touch this enemy, you take damage, which normally is something that annoys me because what are they made of, lava and spikes? Here though, this is not something I would dock points for. It's all just very specific, and it's in that specificity that the game hones its craft. I also want to take a moment to talk about just how unpleasant taking damage is. The audio-visual feedback for this is incredible. The screen seems to shatter upon impact, and just for a brief moment all sound is lost. It's like you've taken a clap to the side of their head and everything inside it has to take a moment to return to normal. It's incredibly visceral and goes a long way to encourage encourage the player to be more agile in their navigation and how they handle fights. Health is an interesting system in this game. You have I guess you'd call it a soul chalice that is filled by successive strikes on enemies, and you can use this pool of energy to heal, so in the early stages at least, taking a hit or two doesn't matter all that much because it can just be reclaimed once the dust has settled. But you also want to keep your soul energy for other abilities gained throughout the game, and this is where those audio-visual flourishes come into it. You need some reason to not take a hit, and a system of feedback that makes you feel like you yourself have taken a whack to the noggin. That'll do it. This is the thing about Hollow Knight. As a complete gaming experience, it's extremely competent, riffing on a lot of familiar tropes, albeit with a level of expertise often missing from other like-minded titles, but it is in the little things that you start to get a peek at its soul. The precise nature of its controls, the audio-visual cues that lead you to exciting little discoveries, the moment of relief whenever you come across a bench and can sit and reflect on your journey, filling in any new areas on the map in the process. Then there's all that cool Dark Souls shit going on, the interlocking areas, hidden pathways, and contraptions requiring some form of decipherment in order to understand how to unlock them. The obfuscation of item descriptions and the feeling of joy you do get whenever you do manage to take down a boss, knowing full well that more exciting exploration awaits you as its carcass collapses into the earth. I've seen enough of Hollow Knight to know I'm probably not going to be able to finish it. It's too precise an experience for my abilities, but that precision is what makes it such a special game to many. It's why folk are absolutely chomping at the bit over any news about Silksong. It's not just another search action title, it's a finely honed, specific and masterfully executed encounter, and I can see why it would be so high on many folks' greatest of all time lists. Right, so I know I said I'd be giving you an update about my Monster Hunter Rise journey, and I will, but what that entails is essentially just a few weeks in July in which I continued working towards high rank, and then a quite intense period of not playing the game as I got really into Slay the Spire instead. So where I stand currently is that I've hit the credits again after felling the Magnum Arlo, now having access to the 6-star hunts, and at the very least I now know how to access high rank, even if I'm not quite there yet. It turns out the Gathering Hub quests, which I've been neglecting since I'm an antisocial bugger, are the key to this, but the game has a clever way of working around that. Since a lot of what you do in the single player component of the game translates across to the Gathering Hub, albeit with slightly different parameters, Rise has a workaround in its license tests, specific hunts requiring you to fell multiple beasts in an allotted period of time. Completion of these runs you up the Gathering Hub ladder a little bit further and quicker than just knocking out individual hunts. So in order to reach high rank you need to access the 4-star quests. I'm currently sitting at 3. It won't take long to hit that target once I get back on the wagon, but there's another element to this that needs to be addressed. I've sank a good dozen hours into this save file, but I still don't feel like I've properly mastered my arsenal. I'm still struggling to make sense of the various weapon builds, and I feel like although I'm getting really good at taking on foes, I'm already hitting a wall in terms of my skill and my ability to prepare for what awaits me in those harder challenges. Part of the solution will come down to something as simple as playing for longer and more regularly, spending more time with individual monsters in order to learn their behavioural patterns and understand how to more efficiently take them down. As a light bowgun main, I have a wide range of ammo types at my disposal, with some more effective on particular beasts than others. I also feel like I'm not utilising all the items I have at my disposal, not just health and stamina potions, but also the demon drugs, traps, bait and so forth. And like I said before, I'm basically playing the game like it's Vanquish, and I feel like I'm missing a critical part of the Monster Hunter experience for it. The beasts themselves, they're a cool bunch. The further up the ladder you climb, the more you come across some weird and wonderful creatures, each with a signature style built from something that already exists in our world. These are perhaps the best animated enemies in any game I've played, displaying behaviours that feel uncannily real. And although the visual design of each monster is unique and iconic, it's in these animations that I think the game truly shines. This is what makes Monster Hunter Monster Hunter, an attempt to distill the vast complexity of nature into an intricate and tactile gameplay experience honed over multiple decades by a team who really know what they're doing. I think before I get back into the game, I'm going to spend some time reading a few wikis and at least make sense of how the weapon crafting system actually works and how best I can tailor my loadouts for each beast. I will catch up with you all on this once again in Volume 4. So, once again Icarus has flown too close to the sun. Another 3 months of the best intentions to play these games and only these games, when in fact it's been a bumper summer of new releases to contend with, as well as the other video essay projects I've been working on alongside this. I never wanted any of this to be disruptive to my life, but inevitably it has. Those icons sitting on my various dashboards as I return home from work too beleaguered and wiped out to really want to play a lot of these games. It's been tougher than usual, and I have to recognise that once again I think this whole endeavour was actually a bad idea. Having said that though, I'm still going ahead with Volume 4. Hubris baby, can't beat it. Here's what to expect from the next edition of the Backlog Diaries. I'll see you all in December.